We're going to view in this video more constraints, namely the simple constraints offered in the motion modifiers list, such as the orient, point and scale. We'll start out here with the simple point constraint, which is a positional constraint. All of these constraints work in the exact same way. You double click them to bring up their interface, and here you can add different constraints. Picking the item you're going to constrain to is easy. In this case I've got small shark and big shark. The point constraint here has been added to small shark, and I've brought up the little interface panel. If I select the item I want to constrain to in the viewport, in this case the big shark, or shark 1 as it's actually known, I can then click add, and the constraint will automatically have selected that as my constraining item. This saves me having to scroll possibly long lists of things, and of course ones for each of the axis. Unlike other constraints, what should be apparent straight away is that you can have different constraining items for different axes. So the X can be following one item, the Y can be following a different item. You also have blends here, weight values that let you blend the effect of the constraint on a given channel in and out, so per channel blending. These can be enveloped as well, so they can be animated. You also have a frame number on which the constraint takes effect. Let me for instance here set it to 2 and click OK. What we can see is that here on frame 0 I can move big shark around and nothing happens, whereas at frame 2 little shark is constrained to him. Ordinarily when rigging you would start this at whatever the first frame is, so most commonly of course frame 0. It would then persist throughout the whole of the scene. The other thing that can be done with simple constraints is the fact that you can add multiples. So unlike same as item, where of course you just had a single positional rotation item, that was it. If you wanted more you had to layer via additional items. In this you do not. You can add additional constraints. So let me say perhaps at this stage I'm going to constrain to something different. Let's say the light. So I select the light and hit add again. I can hit OK for that, and let me just go in and edit it so as I can change the frame. Let's say, I don't know, frame 20 there. We'll now find that at 18 and 19 we are still constrained to big shark, but as soon as we get to frame 20 there, we see that our little shark has jumped to being constrained to the light. So if you're wanting a set of animated constraints over time, so an item hops from being constrained to one item to another item to another item, you can layer them up in the constraints panel like this to take place at different times, as well as of course animating their blend in and blend out weights. Notice this is world axis, so if I say add a null here, and I'm going to make the light a child of the null like this, then when I move the null, the shark still remains constrained to the light. It is a world space or world coordinates constraint. It also makes no odds if I add, say, another null called the S null for shark, and I here make my shark 2 a child of S null. I can simply move S null around and shark 2 remains constrained to the item that he was constrained to. So in this sense it works very much like the world mode in same as item. It's not world coordinates like follower, it's this explicit world position irrespective of other parent spaces. It is worth noting what these guys do in graph editor, because it can be easily missed. If I hit envelope on all three of these, then you'll see we get these target 1, target 2, whatever weights added to the channel bin here. You can then drag all three of them. You'll notice of course they aren't X, Y, Z or HPB or whatever other kind of constraint you've used. Also, if I go back to the other constraint there, edit that and bring up its envelopes, you'll see that I've also got these other target weight 1, 2, 3s. They're not very descriptive effectively of what they are. Commonly you'll grab these channels when you first create the constraint if you do wish to animate their blend, and use an expression to link them to some kind of slider or the position of a null or something else, to give you a slide control that operates all of the different channels at once. So that method of operation is pretty much the same for all of them. The orient and the scale are much the same in their operation. I'll just take a quick look at the scale here first. So if I add and open the simple scale constraint, I can pick the shark 1 again there and just add that, OK it and continue. And of course then when I scale the shark 1, our shark 2 scales along with him. Now let's see how this scale goes through different coordinates. If I parent the shark 1 here, the one that's being followed, to a null, one null, then something goes wrong with shark 2. He still appears to be there, but if we look at his scale, he's reduced down to nothing. This is basically just how scale constraint goes. It doesn't like it too much. If I parent the shark 2 off to the null there instead, you'll see that of course he maintains that relationship of scaling. But what you'll notice is that it's not a world constrained scale in the same way that something like match goal orientation is. We see that this is much like the same as item scale constraint, and that it's just a local coordinates value copy type of constraint, with some unusual behaviours when things are parented across. However, as usual, the most interesting one is the one to do with rotation, the orient constraint. Like all rotational constraints, it's going to obey certain behaviours, and we're going to get certain outcomes from it. So once again, I'll pick the old shark 1 there and add that as my constraining item, and we see that the two are stuck together there, quite admirably so. First thing to worry about with rotations, as always, is pivot rotation. So let's say we put you at 90 degrees there and we record your pivot. How does that affect the constraint to your binder there? Well, we can see that what's happening is when this guy turns on heading, the other one turns on heading. When this one turns on pitch, the other turns on pitch. So we're getting what is more or less a local coordinates type of constraint there. It's the values just being copied directly channel to channel. So then if we kill that for a brief second, put our receiver at 90 and pivot record him, then in theory when we turn it back on it should still all work again. And yes, we notice that it does do that indeed. So what it appears that we have is a rotational constraint that binds two things together as long as their pivots line up and so on and so forth within the same space. And that's not entirely true. Watch what happens if I add a null here. Now I don't do any kind of pivot recording under the null. It's got the base world orientation and rotation, so when these guys are parented to it, their rotation doesn't change at all. Their recorded rotation is still what it is. So we parent them off and we see that things go wrong. We see that this one is still at 0, whereas that one has gone to 90. We can look at the pivot rotations and see that they are recorded correctly for both. Yet still, parented under a null like this, they are misbehaving, even though they're in the same relative space. Pivot recording with this simple orient constraint only really works when both things are pivot recorded the same and they're in the world space. For instance, if we unparent both these guys and just parent, say, the follower to the null, then what we get is something that works correctly, unless that null becomes rotated, in which case we pick up the extra rotation onto the constraining item. If it's the other way, and it is the item being constrained to that is parented under the null, then we get what we saw when both were parented under the null. There is in short only one way to work with the simple item constraint, and that is to make sure that things have their pivots set to 0, so no pivot recording on them. Then either one can be in whichever space you desire, and you get this proper world lineup between the two items. That works if the constrained item is parented off to the null, and that works here where the item being constrained to is parented under something. The same is still true when the item doing the constraining is parented under something, and you get this world style sort of lineup between the two. Notice also that it matters not if we take this parent null and we pivot record it. As long as the item that we're doing the constraining on does not get pivot recorded, the whole thing still works just fine. As soon, however, as you pivot record that guy into place, you can see it goes wrong again. It is of a fashion working, it's just got this offset to it, and you're getting a value copy channel per channel. It's simply, of course, the reason that you get this apparent world behavior when you're not recording pivots is because you have the pivots in line. Their axes always line up with one another. So when you get this crossover of values, they maintain that line. So those are the simple motion modifier constraints. The fact that they work outside of IK helps when you want to have a simple item constraint working one way and then a same as item constraint working the other. This allows you to do double crossovers of constraint. A goes to B or B goes to A. A useful little trick for pulling off some fancier and sometimes very animation friendly rigging tools.